Okay, this was a very fun video for me to research because I went down that rabbit hole and covered 200 years of Florida history, mainly about this man here, James Page. And this is a biography that I picked up at the library, Father James Page, Enslaved Preachers Climb to Freedom by Larry Eugene Rivers from Florida A&M University. And there's some physical places that you can visit today connected with him. So I want to do the Seminole War connection and see where else they'll go. And hold on a minute. Let me, okay, let me share screen. Okay, here we are, Reverend James Page. And this is a picture from Florida Memory. Most of the photographs are either from Florida Memory or Find a Grave. Find a Grave's actually one of the biggest places I go to research some people sometimes. So anyway, Reverend James Page established two different churches that we have in Tallahassee. He established more than that, but we have two that remain. Maybe there's a few more out there, but these are the only two that I know about. Bethlehem Missionary Baptist Church and Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. So we're going to see both of those later. Well, let's talk about him. Reverend James Page, here he is, was born in 1808, and there's two pictures of him on Florida Memory, and you you can't convince me that they're the same people because mainly the hairline is different on. So I don't know, but maybe somebody knows better than I do. So James Page was born in Richmond, Virginia, and he was an enslaved person, of course. His father was a free person of color, and his mother was a slave. Well, they were slaves of John Parkhill, and we'll see him in a moment. Now, his mother and his younger brother were eventually sold to another slave owner, and his father actually joined the group that went back to Africa when they established Liberia with the Monroe thing of establishing a country for the former slaves to go back to in Africa. And James Page's father was killed uh, going back once he got back to Liberia. So tragic story there. So he was an enslaved person the first half of his life. And this was his slave master, John Parkhill, who was born in Ireland, 1786 to 1855. He was a very strict Presbyterian, a very religious man. In fact, his obituary is just overflowing with biblical references. And so he was quite a different slave owner. For one thing, he had a mercantile store in Richmond, and he actually taught James Page to read and write. So when Mr. Parkhill was gone, James, he would mind the store, even as like from age 15 on, he would be like the store clerk, keeping record of the store and everything. But apparently he did a good job of it too. And Mr. Parkhill encouraged James to uh, read the Bible and study the Bible and read and write. So, not every slaves were taught to read and write, but it was not uncommon to use slaves as storekeepers or to run the business when the master was away. Um, so anyway, John and his brother Samuel, and we'll talk about Samuel in a minute, uh, they got into some bankruptcy in Richmond, and uh, mostly due to the debt from the War of 1812. And so that they moved to Florida. This, I guess, a summons to appear in court from 1830. And so they moved to Tallahassee in the frontier in Florida. to try their luck in a different place. Now, John Parkhill, he was active working in the Union Bank, or what they called it, the Planters Bank at that time. He was a cashier at the Planters Bank, and kind of unusual that slaves were property. They were actually mortgaged. So Reverend James Page, he actually had three mortgages on his master used him to, you know, as collateral on the mortgage. Therefore, we don't think of that today, but uh, as much of a Bible believing man as Mr. Parkhill was, he was strictly business on their side. And of course, the bank lasted for about 10 years until it finally collapsed in 1843 due to some shady bank deals and, just uh, and also connected to the bank crisis in the National Bank up in Washington. So anyway, but Mr. Parkhill coming down to Florida, he became a very wealthy man. He sold most all of his slaves and all of his property when he came down to Florida. And kind of interesting, he only took some of the younger slaves, which included uh, James Page. So Mr. Parkhill, he gave up a wealthy mansion in Richmond and say he was even living in a single room cabin in Tallahassee with a dirt floor and 9 people living in there. And his slaves were living in tents. Um, but, they're uh, so it was kind of rough for everyone, rougher if you're a slave, but if you're wealthy planning. And Mr. Parkhill also came down with the other planter millionaires, like Chairs and Randolph and a lot of the founders of Tallahassee. And John Parkhill, this is his grave in St. John's Cemetery. Uh, this Find a Page now has all the graves there indexed going on the church record, and they did D2 and cleaned up the tombstone. Interesting that this cemetery with all these plantation owners is right next to the church that James Page established. And this is his son, George Washington Parkhill, after the death of John Parkhill. George Washington Parkhill, he was a physician. He was also involved in the early government in Florida as well. During the Civil War, he uh, became an officer and he was killed in the Battle of Gaines Mill right before the fall of Richmond, Virginia. Um, but anyway, when he was killed, they were bringing the body through town, passed by a mansion, and one of the servants says, "Who there? Who do you have uh, on there?" And they said, "This is the body of George Washington Parkhill." And he said, "Bring him inside because he was born in this mansion." And G.W. Parkhill's buried in Richmond. This is the brother of John Parkhill, also born in Ireland, much younger brother from 1798, born in Ireland until he died in 1841. And he was the bad boy. John Parkhill was the good brother, and Samuel Parkhill, he, he was the bad one of the family. To show you about that, he had actually got in a fight over I don't know, over his collapsing business in Richmond, and got in a Bowie knife fight in a bar. Something an Irishman would do, and that's perfectly fine. And if you're in Natchez, Mississippi, not so fine in Richmond. So he actually went running from the law, is ordered for him to be arrested, and he fled to Tallahassee, and that's kind of one of the reasons that brought the Parkhills down to Tallahassee. So in 1827, he escaped justice um, from nearly killing a man in a bar fight and came to Tallahassee, which I guess they figured is perfectly fine. In fact, the records of Tallahassee's history in the early days are just full of similar stories like that. He did very well, as also became a rich planter in Florida. You can't really read it because it's too small, but on the left there, that's a news article from the Battle of Withlacoochee that he published the report in the newspaper. He became active in the militia. Samuel Parkhill, he became the adjutant general in the Florida militia. And in fact, they call him general in the obituary here. So his obituary, he was shipping cotton down around Port Leon, uh, Magnolia, and during the yellow fever epidemic in 1841. And he died. Kind of confusing because on the right-hand side, an article about Magnolia Cemetery saying he was buried there. But according to the records in St. John's Cemetery, here he is, apparently buried in St. John's Cemetery in an unmarked grave. He's on the register of the church registry of the burials and the gravesite. And in the family plot, we have his wife, or and she was like one of his wives, and he was her first husband. She married two more times after he died. So he could be buried in either Magnolia or St. John's Cemetery. Either one. It's very unusual for somebody who died of yellow fever to move the body to another cemetery. Usually they are just buried in mass graves. They estimate about maybe about 1,600 people um, died in Tallahassee during the yellow fever epidemic, including one of the governors, Robert Raymond Reed. This is the son of Samuel Parkhill. This is John Parkhill, not the son of John Parkhill, but the son of Samuel Parkhill, born in 1823 in Richmond, died in 1857 in Big Cypress. So he organized the militia unit for Leon County during the Third Seminole War. Here's a news article saying that they're going down to Ocala. From there, they went down to Fort Brooke in Tampa Bay, and then they went scouting around Big Cypress. I guess from Tampa Bay, they went down to uh, Fort Myers. Yeah, they went to Fort Myers, and he was scouting around in Big Cypress, chasing it down a trail of the Seminoles, crossing a creek. They were ambushed, and he was shot and killed instantly. He was the highest ranking officer killed during the Third Seminole War. And one of the few monuments to the Third Seminole War is an obelisk in front of the old Capitol. Here it is. This picture is about 12 years old when I took, but um, the Capitol is going some renovation work right now, so there's scaffolding all around the Capitol building. But anyway, this is interesting. This monument to Captain John Parkhill, killed at Royal Palm Hammock in November 28th, 1857. Originally, he was supposedly buried at Deep Lake in Big Cypress. And, I've always wondered for years, and then I found out recently that there's a tombstone in Barrancas National Cemetery for him. Uh, I don't have any other information at this time. This would be interesting to look into to find out is how he got reinterred at Fort Barrancas. I would think if they had dug up his body at Deep Lake, that they would have brought it back either to like Fort Myers or Fort Brooke or even Tallahassee. I don't know why they had sent it up to Pensacola, so it doesn't make any sense to me. But that's a mystery I'll have to research. Back to James Page here. He is married in 1851, which was also kind of unusual to be married as a slave. Usually they had unofficial unions. So he lived quite a life. He was then in Florida. He was the overseer of Parkhills plantation. First is the plantation Tuscaloosa up near what's now Lake Jackson, and also the later on the overseer when Parkhill bought property down in Bel Air next to Achille Murat and his area. The Bel Air plantation was kind of a resort for the politicians in Tallahassee. So James Page, he actually did very well for a slave. And because of his Bible study and his preaching ability, he started preaching. First, he would preach in brush arbors, and then he was encouraged by Mr. Parkhill to start preaching in churches. The brush arbors were looked at with suspicion, and the preaching Black people were looked at with suspicion because some of the rebellions, like the Nat Turner Rebellion, the people who incited those were actually preachers as well and pastors. Uh, so, but Mr. Page, he walked a very thin line and was very skillful at balancing between the two worlds of being a slave, an enslaved person, and also looking at creative ways that he could get his freedom. Is that the white people liked it, that he would treat obedience, that the Apostle Paul would preach it. And then again, when he would preach to his Black congregations, he would preach independence and self-reliance. And so it's not rebelling, but it's, how to go off on your own. And so Mr. Parkhill died and his son George took over the slaves. But that was only for uh, about 10 years. And then George was uh, killed in the Civil War, and it went to uh, George's wife, I believe. I think her name was Harriet. But anyway, at the end of the war, and when emancipation happened, and during Reconstruction, Mr. Page, he established several churches. Excuse me here. And he was the first Black legislator elected to the state legislature. Uh, Representative, served for 2 years. He was a town marshal in Tallahassee. And beforehand, when he was a slave, he was given very unusual leeway. He would take the cotton down to St. Mark's to get shipped, sometimes alone. He would often travel alone and unarmed. And if you didn't have a pass, it was very much you can be apprehended by people looking for fugitive slaves, and who would often hang or shoot slaves that they found who were unescorted. So he did a very unusual ministry, going from church to church, oftentimes unescorted by anybody, sometimes not even with a pass. And there's a couple times he said he was at gunpoint, and not only preaching in Florida, in this area in Tallahassee, but he was given the extraordinary ability to go preach at congregations in Alabama, Georgia, and even South Carolina. So that's amazing for somebody, for a former slave. So now we go through from slavery, Seminole War. Now we're at Reconstruction, and so now he's, uh, you know, Black legislature. Now he's establishing churches. One of the churches he established still exists today. It's at the Tallahassee Museum. It's Bethlehem Missionary Baptist Church, and it was first at Bel Air, and then it was moved to the Tallahassee Museum. Oh, thing I might want to mention is that Mr. Parkhill, strict Presbyterian, is that why was he a Presbyterian and James Page was a Baptist? Well, Mr. Page, to get ordained a preacher at the time, the Presbyterians would not ordain a Black person, a Black man, to be a preacher. So he went to the Baptist church, who was more lenient, who would ordain him as a pastor. And so this is a church you can actually visit. I visited a few weeks ago, but warning, during the summer, there's no air condition inside, so it's like a sweat lodge. But I thought it was really neat going into one of these original churches, maybe built around 1870. And the other church that he established is a major church here in Tallahassee, Bethel Missionary Baptist Church in downtown Tallahassee. Also says it was built in 1870, but this is not the original building. It's gone through different renovations and reconstructions, I think in the 50s, and then in 1976, and then another one in 2000. And this is the big church right next to the cemetery where the Parkhills are buried. You can't see it in this picture, But to the left of the church is St. John's Cemetery. I mean, they're just right next to each other. Major church, it's not a very large church, but it has beautiful stained glass windows, which I think they saved from the original building. A couple blocks away, they have a charter school, the C.K. Steele School and Leroy Collins. C.K. Steele and Leroy Collins, and both figures in the civil rights movement. So this is a church that James Page established. In front, you see that historical marker. Here it is. It's a newly established historical marker telling about Father James Page, and you can park across the street when they're not in service and look at the marker. You can't go in the cemetery because that's locked up, but you can visit, find a grave page. Now, Father Page, he is not buried next door in the St. John Cemetery, but he's buried across the street in the Old City Cemetery in the black section, and he's buried there. He died in 1883, and his wife Elizabeth, she lived many years after him into the 20th century, I believe. So interesting history. It became a big part of the civil rights. And this was Reverend C.K. Steele. He was many years as a pastor here. He originally was born in West Virginia, and then I think he was in North Carolina. Came to Tallahassee about 1954, I believe. And during the civil rights upheaval, Tallahassee also had the uh, what they called the bus protests, like Montgomery, where there was two students on the bus, and they refused to give up their seat to a white woman, and so that caused I guess, them getting arrested. And then there's bus protest where the black people in town refused to ride the bus and threatened to bankrupt the buses. So they were, instead of riding the bus, they were carpooling. And then the police in town would stop the people carpooling and arrest the drivers for running a unlicensed transportation business or something like that. Something we consider crazy today. You know, we have Uber and Lyft, uh, and don't even think anything of it. There was another time when some FSU students were holding a party, and I think it's 1956. Some white students, at the time FSU was predominantly white, maybe all white, and you have the Black University, Florida A&M University, also in Tallahassee. Well, the white students invited some black students from Florida A&M to their party, and in fact, because of that, were expelled from the school for allowing uh, some black men to come to their party. So actually, they actually spoke at the church. There's a picture in C.K. Steele. He was a very good friend of Martin Luther King. Many of the civil rights leaders spoke at the church. Amazing history. There's a video on Florida Memory of a young Jesse Jackson giving a sermon at the church. Here it is during the time of the bus protests. The KKK burned a cross on the lawn of the front church. That's amazing. We're within walking distance of the Florida Capitol at this point, and this is happening in downtown Tallahassee. Um, so that's amazing history. But he was a famous, church preacher in the civil rights history. His son was Darrell Steele, well-known blues guitarist. I've heard him play. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but he was a very good guitar player. I mean, he was just awesome. There's actually some videos on YouTube. You can look up Darrell Steele and see him playing. So he was very good. So amazing history here. Uh, so it goes to show we have two churches connecting to a slave from the Seminole War who's the nephew of his master was killed in the Seminole War. So anyway, once again, Father James Page, look it up in the library or buy a copy of the book. I'll probably buy a copy after borrowing the library copy. Father James Page, Enslaved Preachers Climb to Freedom, where Eugene Rivers. And it was a little, not, it covered a little more topics than your usual Seminole War video, and I hope you like it.